Roman Calder had given the obey or quit speech maybe 200 times in his career, and it had never once required a second take. He leaned back in the glass conference room, 40 people watching through the walls, and delivered it the way you'd flick off a light. Sign the certificate, Miles, or clean out your desk. Those are the options. There is no third thing. Miles Rourke looked at him for about 3 seconds. Then he did the thing nobody in that building would stop talking about for the rest of the year. He uncapped his pen, the good one, the one his daughter had given him, and instead of signing the certificate of conformance sitting in front of him, he drew a single line through it, corner to corner, slow and deliberate. He wrote 4 words underneath in block letters. He slid it back across the table so it faced Calder. He capped the pen, clipped it in his pocket, picked up the one folder he'd walked in with, and left. He didn't slam anything. He didn't say a word. The 4 words he'd written on a federal safety certificate in front of the CEO and 40 witnesses were: 11 days later, in a boardroom on the 14th floor, a different set of witnesses watched Roman Calder's face come apart, one muscle at a time, as a video played on the wall, a crash test video, a child-sized dummy, a car seat, harness doing something a harness must never do. And the general counsel of Gardwell said very quietly into the silence, "Mr. Calder, who signed the certificate after Mr. Rourke refused?" This is the story of a man who wouldn't put his name on something. And the reason he could walk out of that room without a word, the real reason, is not the reason you're thinking. Miles Rourke was 44 and had one of those jobs that is invisible until the day it's the only thing that matters. His title was Director of Quality and Regulatory Compliance. What that meant in the specific world of Gardwell juvenile safety was that Miles was the human being whose signature went on the federal certificates that said, a child car seat would do what a child car seat is supposed to do: hold a small body still in the half-second when the world stops. He was the authorized signatory, the person of record. When Gardwell told the government its seats met the standard, they said it in Miles Rourke's name, because a certificate like that has to be signed by a named, licensed, personally accountable individual, not a company, not a logo, a person. So that when it's a lie, there's someone whose hand was on it. For 9 years, no one at Gardwell had ever had to think about what that meant, because for 9 years Miles had never signed anything that wasn't true, and it had never cost anyone anything, and so nobody noticed it was the load-bearing wall of the whole building. He didn't look like a load-bearing wall. He looked like a guy who coached middle school soccer, which he did. He wore fleece vests and drove a paid-off sedan with a dented rear door he'd never fixed because it still closed fine. He packed a lunch. He had, by every appearance a person could make in a hallway, a completely ordinary middle manager's life. Here is the thing about Miles Rourke that mattered, and it was not money. Miles had built his life on purpose so that no one could ever make him choose between his kid and the truth. Not a fortune, not a secret account. Just a specific, boring, deliberate kind of freedom. A small mortgage he could cover on a fraction of his salary. No debt. A modest cushion and a professional license that was his portable personal worth more than the job. Because a licensed compliance professional who won't lie can walk out of one company and into another, and everyone in the industry who matters knows exactly why. He had made himself in the only way that actually works hard to own. He'd tell you it wasn't courage. He'd tell you courage is what people call it afterward, when they don't want to admit the real answer, which is that the brave person just arranged their life so the brave thing wouldn't bankrupt them. He'd tell you he'd learned that the hard way a long time ago from watching a man who hadn't. But that's the held card. That comes later. There was one person who thought Miles's whole careful life was ridiculous, and she was 13, and she lived with him. Piper Rourke had her mother's sharp chin and her father's refusal to let a wrong thing go. Miles and her mom had split when Piper was 6. No war, just 2 people who'd become roommates. And it had been mostly the 2 of them ever since, with a custody calendar on the fridge and a rule that Sunday nights were for terrible movies and better popcorn. Piper thought her dad was a little bit of a sucker. Not in a mean way. In the way of a 13-year-old who has noticed that the world seems to reward the loud, the flashy, and the guy who cuts the line, and who has a father who does none of that, who returns the extra change, who reports his own mistakes, who once drove back to a store because they'd forgotten to charge him for a bag of mulch. You know, nobody would ever find out, she'd said that time in the car, 12 years old and certain. I'd find out, Miles had said. That's such a dad answer. It's the only answer there is, kid. You're the one who has to live in your own head. Might as well keep it a place you'd want to live. Piper had rolled her eyes so hard he heard it. She would remember that conversation word for word in about 2 weeks, standing in her kitchen holding a folder she wasn't supposed to have found, and it would change what she decided to do with it. If you wanted to understand why Roman Calder eventually chose Miles Rourke for the ultimatum, why of everyone in the building Miles read as the safest bet to fold, you had to understand that Miles never made a show of the thing that made him unable to fold. There was a day, 8 months earlier, that the plant still talked about quietly the way people talk about a thing they didn't understand at the time. A supplier had shipped a lot of harness buckles that came in a hair under spec. Nothing you'd feel, nothing a customer would ever notice, a tolerance thing on a release button. Purchasing wanted them used. The lot was worth real money. The deviation was on paper defensible. Everyone expected Miles to sign the deviation because everyone always signed the deviation. Miles pulled 40 buckles at random and cycled each one 10,000 times on a test rig over a weekend himself on a Saturday, while his daughter did homework in the break room. 39 were fine. One failed at 8,000 cycles, 1 in 40. He rejected the entire lot. It cost the quarter a number. Purchasing was furious. And when the plant manager asked him not unkindly whether one bad buckle out of 40 was really worth the money, Miles had said the sentence that a young test engineer named Raina, 2 weeks into the job, terrified, certain she was about to watch a director cave to money, never forgot. It's a release button on a car seat. 1 in 40 means one family. I don't get to meet the family, so I have to be the family. That's the whole job. Then he'd gone back to his desk and never mentioned it again. And Raina had gone home that night and understood for the first time what the job she'd taken was actually for. That was Miles Rourke. Not loud about it. Not a crusader. Just a man who had decided a long time ago that the number on a report was always a person, and who had arranged his entire life so that remembering it wouldn't cost him his daughter's dinner. Roman Calder looked at all of that. The modest house, the paid-off car, the single income, the kid, and saw a man he could squeeze. He saw the leash. He never once saw the thing that made the leash pointless. Gardwell was that autumn betting the entire company on a car seat called the Ascend. It was the good kind of product, the kind that justifies a company existing, a convertible seat with a genuinely clever new load-limiting harness, priced to actually reach families who couldn't spend $400 on the premium brands. It had taken 3 years. It had a national retail launch, locked every store in a major chain on shelf the Monday before the biggest shopping week of the year. A set date that could not move because retail set dates do not move for anyone. And it had a CEO named Roman Calder, who had told the board in writing that the Ascend would ship on time. Calder was 56 and ran Gardwell the way a certain kind of executive runs everything, by treating every problem as a negotiation and every person as a position in it. He was not a monster. That's important, and it's what made him dangerous. He genuinely believed he was a reasonable man making hard calls in a hard world, and he had spent 30 years being rewarded for exactly that belief, and he had never yet met a wall he couldn't talk pressure or price his way through. He was about to meet Miles Rourke's name. The clock started at 8:50 on a Thursday morning. The final dynamic crash test results came back on the last validation batch of the Ascend, the real ones, the sled tests, a child-sized dummy, and a wall of high-speed cameras. And on 3 of the 12 runs, the new harness did the thing it had been designed specifically never to do. It slipped. Under peak load on a particular strap, geometry that only showed up in the production tooling, the webbing paid out a few extra centimeters, and a few extra centimeters on a 35-pound dummy is the difference between a head that stays where it belongs and a head that doesn't. 3 out of 12. A 25% failure on the one thing the seat exists to do. Fixing it meant retooling the harness anchor. Retooling meant 6 weeks. 6 weeks meant missing the set date. Missing the set date meant the retailer walked, the launch collapsed, and the quarter Roman Calder had personally promised the board went from triumph to catastrophe. The test engineer who ran it, a careful young woman named Raina, flagged it red and sent it up the chain exactly as she was supposed to, and it landed on the desk of the man whose job was to decide what the company would certify. Miles Rourke read the report twice, drove to the test lab, watched the 3 failing runs himself on the high-speed footage, and then sat in his car in the parking lot for 4 minutes with his hands on the wheel, because he knew before anyone said a word to him exactly what was going to be asked of him, and exactly what he was going to say, and exactly what it was going to cost. Then he went upstairs. 9:30 a.m. Calder called him into the glass conference room. Not his office. The glass room in the middle of the floor, walls on all sides, 40 people at their desks with a clear view. Calder liked an audience for this kind of thing. An audience does half the work. Trent Mosby was there too, VP of Operations 41, the man who stood behind Calder's shoulder in every photo and laughed a half-second early at every joke. And a certificate of conformance printed, tabbed, ready. And a pen. Miles, good, sit. Calder didn't look up. We need the Ascend COC filed by 4 so the trucks roll tonight. I had Trent pre-fill it. Just needs your signature. Rung 1. Miles stayed standing. The Ascend failed dynamic 3 out of 12 this morning. Harness slip under peak load. It's a red. It can't be certified. I saw the report. Calder finally looked up and his voice was patient, reasonable, the voice of a man explaining weather. 12 runs, 3 anomalies on a pre-production geometry. Raina's a good kid, she's cautious, that's her job. But you and I both know test variance exists. 9 of 12 passed clean. A car seat that fails 1 in 4 isn't variance. It's a defect. We'd fix the anchor and rerun. Rung 2. We don't have 6 weeks. Calder slid the certificate an inch closer. Here's what we're going to do. We file the COC on the 9 passing runs. The 3 anomalies get logged as engineering samples, pre-tooling, non-representative, excluded from the cert basis. Completely defensible on paper. We ship, we hit the date, and the harness anchor gets quietly revised in the January production run. First 8 weeks of units, nobody's in a crash anyway, statistically. By the time volume's on the road, it's fixed. The room through the glass could see Calder talking and Miles not moving. They could not hear that a man in a fleece vest was being asked calmly to certify that a seat which failed would hold. You want me to exclude the failing runs from the cert basis, Miles said, and sign that it meets the standard. I want you to make a business call like an adult. You want me to put my name on a car seat I watched fail this morning. Federal certificate. My signature. Certifying to the government and to every parent who buys one that it does the thing it doesn't do. I want you, Calder said, and here the patience thinned just slightly, to be a team player on the most important launch in the history of this company. Rung 3. Miles was quiet for a moment, and then he said the only thing he'd say in that room that had any heat in it, and even then the heat was low and level. No. Calder blinked. People did not say no to Roman Calder in the glass room. That was the entire reason the glass room existed. He leaned back. He laced his fingers. And he reached for the move that had never once failed him in 30 years. The move he only ever made after he'd checked. Because Roman Calder never fired that particular weapon at someone who could survive it. And he had checked Miles Rourke's file 2 days ago and seen a single father, 1 income, a kid, a mortgage, a modest life with no visible room in it. Miles, I'm going to be very clear because I like you and I don't want you to make a mistake in front of the whole floor. His voice dropped into something almost kind, which was worse. Sign the certificate or clean out your desk. Those are the options. There is no third thing. And before you get noble about it, think about the kid at home. Think about what an unemployed compliance director with a refused a lawful instruction note in his file looks like to the next employer. Think about your daughter's Thanksgiving. Rung 4. He'd said it out loud. The leash named in front of 40 people. Think about your daughter. And the whole floor watching through the glass saw Miles Rourke go very still. They expected, everyone who could see it expected the thing that always happened next. The slump. The small collapse. The okay fine of a cornered man remembering who was counting on him. Instead, Miles Rourke uncapped his pen. He looked at the certificate for 1 second. And then, instead of signing it, he drew a single slow line across the whole page, corner to corner. Underneath it, he wrote in block capitals a foot from Roman Calder's folded hands. He capped the pen. He clipped it to his vest. He picked up the one folder he'd brought in his own copy of the crash test report, the red one, and he walked out of the glass room across the floor past 40 people who had stopped pretending to work, and he did not say a single word to any of them. The glass door sighed shut behind him. And Roman Calder sat in a see-through box in front of his entire company looking down at a federal safety certificate with a line drawn through it, and 4 words written under the line, and for the first time in 30 years, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. Here is what the floor saw, and here is the story it told itself, and the two are the same, and that's the tragedy. The floor saw the CEO come down to the glass room on the morning everyone knew the Ascend was in trouble. They saw it get tense. And they saw Miles Rourke, director of quality, the guy who'd been there 9 years, the guy who signed off on everything, pick up a folder and walk out of the building without a word on the exact day the biggest launch in company history was hanging by a thread. You know what a scared building concludes. He bailed. The ascend's a disaster, and Rourke saw it coming and got out before his name was on the wreck. Didn't warn us, didn't fight, just grabbed his folder and left us holding it. Because from the outside, with no sound and no context, that is precisely what it looked like, a man protecting himself the instant it got dangerous. By lunch, it was moving through the plant like dye through water. By the end of the day, the people whose jobs Miles Rourke had just detonated his own career to protect were in the parking lot and the break room and the group chats calling him a coward. A quitter. The compliance guy who talked a big game about integrity for 9 years and walked the second it got expensive. Raina, the young test engineer, the one who'd flagged the red, didn't believe it because she'd watched the same footage he had. But she was 26 and 11 months in, and when she started to say, wait, the test actually failed, he might have a senior guy cut her off with. Of course the test failed. That's why he ran, and she looked at the floor and stopped talking and hated herself for stopping. Which is a thing that happens in these stories more than anyone admits. Miles knew it would happen. That's the part that matters. He drove home. He did not call a reporter. He did not blast the company on the internet. He did not phone a single coworker to explain that he hadn't run, that he'd been ordered to certify a defective child car seat and had refused in front of the CEO and walked out of a 9-year career rather than sign it. He said nothing. He let the building call him a coward. Because, and he'd say this later when they finally asked what was I going to do, get on the phone and tell 40 people what a hero I was. They still had jobs to keep and a launch to survive. My reputation wasn't the emergency. The seat was. He made Piper her dinner. She asked how work was. He said work was complicated and that he might be looking for a new job soon and that it was going to be okay because they'd planned for exactly this and she should not worry about the money. She didn't ask the right question that night. She asked it 2 nights later. And by then she'd found the folder. Miles had left the folder in his bag, the canvas bag by the door. His own copy of the crash test report, the red 1-3 failing runs, and clipped to it the certificate of conformance he'd drawn a line through which he'd quietly photographed on his way out. Because a lifetime of compliance work teaches you to keep the record, even when you're the one walking away from it. He hadn't hidden it well because he hadn't imagined anyone would go looking. Piper went looking because of something a boy said at school. The boy's father worked at Gardwell on the floor, and the boy had heard the parking lot version, and on Wednesday he said it to Piper at her locker with the casual cruelty of 13-year-olds. My dad says your dad chickened out and screwed everybody right before Christmas. Piper came home furious in the specific way she'd inherited from the man she was furious on behalf of. She wanted proof he was wrong. She went into his bag looking for something, anything to throw back at that boy, and she found a report with the word fail in red, and a car seat harness and a certificate with a line drawn through it, and 4 words in her father's block capitals, not with my name. She was 13, but she was not stupid, and she had been raised at the dinner table of a man who explained things. She read enough of the report to understand 3 things in order: that the seat had failed a crash test, that her father had refused to sign that it passed, and that the reason 40 people were calling him a coward was the exact opposite of the truth. She stood in the kitchen holding it and thought about the conversation in the car. You know, nobody would ever find out. And I'd find out. And Piper Rourke made a decision that her father would never have made, because her father had decided long ago that doing the right thing and being seen to do it were 2 different transactions, and you only get one, and Piper at 13 was not yet willing to accept that trade. She looked up who you tell about an unsafe car seat. It turns out the government makes it easy. There is a federal vehicle safety hotline and an online report portal for exactly this, run by the Highway Safety Administration, built so that any ordinary person who thinks a car seat is dangerous can say so. It does not require you to be an engineer. It does not require you to be an adult. Piper photographed the report and the lined-out certificate with her phone. She typed in her own words in the careful, over-punctuated prose of a furious 8th grader. What she understood: that Gardwell's new Ascend seat had failed its crash test 3 times, that the company was shipping it anyway for the holiday, and that her dad, the compliance director, had refused to sign off, and everyone was calling him a coward for it. She attached the photos. She hit submit at 9:52 on a Wednesday night. Then she told her father what she'd done. Miles Rourke went pale in a way Piper had never seen. Not angry. Scared for her, first always for her. Piper. That report that's the company's. You could have... You're always telling me to keep my head a place I'd want to live. Her chin was up her mother's chin. I couldn't live in a version where I found that and didn't do anything. You couldn't either. That's the whole thing you're always saying. And Miles Rourke, who had spent 2 decades building a life quiet enough to let him do the right thing without a fuss, looked at his 13-year-old who had just done the right thing with the maximum possible fuss, and could not for the life of him find the part of it that was wrong. No, he admitted. I couldn't either. He didn't know yet that she'd just moved the entire timeline up by 2 months and put a lit match to the fuse Roman Calder thought he had until January to defuse. 2 things were already true when Piper hit submit, and together they turned her report from a complaint into a detonation. The first, Trent Mosby had signed the certificate. 4 hours after Miles walked out, Calder had turned to the man behind his shoulder and made the same offer, and Trent Mosby had asked exactly one question: is this going to be reflected in my comp? And then signed a federal safety certificate for a seat he knew had failed. The trucks had rolled. The Ascend was on shelves. The second, the retailer, the national chain staking its holiday on the Ascend, ran its own independent product safety audits and had one scheduled as a matter of routine for units off the first production run. A spot check. The kind of thing that usually confirms what the certificate says and gets filed and forgotten. Piper's report reached the Highway Safety Administration's early warning system on Thursday. A defect report naming a specific model a specific failure mode, and this was the part that made an analyst sit up. A photograph of an internal crash test summary showing the exact failure the report described. That is not a crank complaint, that is a document. The regulator flagged it. The retailer contacted moved its routine audit up and made it not routine. And when the retailer's own engineers put a production Ascend on a sled that Friday, it did precisely what Miles Rourke had watched it do the previous Thursday. Under peak load, the harness slipped. By the following Monday, there was a hold on every Ascend in the chain. By Wednesday, there was an emergency session of the Guardwell board, because a certificate with a named signatory had just been contradicted by a crash test. And boards understand exactly one thing with perfect clarity, and it is the sound the word federal falsification makes when it lands next to a company's name. They pulled the certificate to see whose name was on it. It was Trent Mosby's. And then they pulled the first certificate, the one from the day of the deadline, and found it voided with a line drawn through it, and 4 words written underneath in the hand of the compliance director, who had refused 11 days earlier in front of 40 witnesses to sign the thing that was now blowing up the company. The board asked one question before anything else. Where is Miles Rourke, and does he still have his copies? He did. He'd kept it. He always kept the record. And he had one more thing they didn't know about, yet the thing he'd done quietly on his way out the door, the held card. But that comes at the end. They brought Miles back into the building he'd walked out of, up to a boardroom he'd never been in, and they sat him at a long table across from Roman Calder, and this time there was no glass room and no audience of 40. This time the audience was the board of directors, the general counsel and outside attorney, a regulator's liaison on a video screen, and Trent Mosby, who had the specific gray color of a man who has recently understood what happens to the hand that holds the pen when the daylight comes. The general counsel, a precise woman named Adaize Kwan, who had spent the weekend reading, did not make a speech. She played a video. It was the crash test. The high-speed footage slowed down. A child-sized dummy in an Ascend. The sled fired, the world stopped, and the harness on the wall, 40 feet wide in front of the entire board, paid out its few extra centimeters, and the small dummy's head went exactly where a small head must never be allowed to go. She let it play 3 times. Nobody spoke. Then Adaize Kwan turned to Roman Calder and asked in a voice with no temperature in it at all, "Mr. Calder, who signed the certificate after Mr. Rourke refused?" And Roman Calder, who had spent 30 years being the most reasonable man in every room, who had a counter for every argument, and a price for every person reached for the reasonable voice, and found that it had stopped working. There was a business judgment, he said, about test variance. The passing runs were representative. I made a call about a defensible cert basis, and in hindsight, you excluded the failing runs from the certificate basis, Kwan said. You instructed that a 25% dynamic failure be logged as non-representative engineering samples. You directed the filing of a federal certificate of conformance for a seat you had personally been shown to fail. And when your director of compliance refused to sign it in writing with his reason in front of 40 people, you told him to obey or quit. and then you found someone who would. She slid a page across the table. It was the lined-out certificate, not with my name. This was on your desk. You kept it. Why? Calder had no answer for that, because the true answer was that he'd kept it as proof of Miles's insubordination, back when he was still certain the story would end with Miles as the problem. And there is no version of saying that out loud that survives contact with the video still frozen on the wall. His face came apart slowly. Not into grief. Roman Calder did not feel grief. And this is the important part. This is why it lands. It came apart into calculation that has run out of road. You could watch him look for the exit and find one by one that every door he'd ever used was locked from the other side. The pressure play gone. There was no one in this room he had leverage on. The reasonable man voice gone. The video had made reasonable a joke. The blame shift he tried at one flick of the eyes toward Trent Mosby, and Adaise Kwan said without even looking up, "Mr. Mosby signed a document you ordered him to sign. We'll deal with Mr. Mosby. We're dealing with you." And the last door clicked shut. He did not apologize. That's the detail to hold on to. Even then, cornered finished on camera, Roman Calder did not say, "I'm sorry." What he said in the flattened voice of a man stating a fact he still believed was, "I made a call. Everybody in this industry makes that call. I'm just the one who got a whistleblower's kit on the hotline." And Miles Rourke, who had not spoken once, spoke then, quietly, to Calder across the table in front of the board. "That's the whole thing right there," Miles said. "You think the only difference between you and everyone else is that I got caught. You think everybody would have signed it. And you're almost right, that's what makes you good at this. You checked my file before you picked me. Single dad, one income a kid. You fired that ultimatum at me because you were sure I couldn't afford to say no." He set his own copy of the certificate on the table next to hers. "You didn't lose because I'm braver than the last 20 people who signed for you. I'm not. You lost because I spent my whole life making sure that when this exact room happened, I could afford to be in it. That's the part you can't check for. You can check a man's savings. You can't check whether he decided a long time ago that his name wasn't for sale." He stood up. "You were holding a leash. It just wasn't attached to anything." Then he picked up his folder, and for the second time in 11 days, Miles Rourke walked out of a room without waiting to be dismissed. Only this time the whole board stood up. One of them, an older woman who'd sat on that board for 15 years and had voted 6 weeks earlier to approve the Ascend launch on Roman Calder's personal assurance, put out a hand as Miles passed and stopped him just for a second. "Mr. Rourke, the certificate, the one you drew the line through." Her voice wasn't quite steady. "If you'd signed it, if you'd just signed it like the last 20 people who sat where you were sitting, those seats would be in cars right now. In real cars with real children in them all through the holidays, and not one of us in this room would ever have known until a family found out for us. On a highway, in the half-second." "I know," Miles said. "How many people said no before you?" Miles thought about it. "To Calder. On something like this." He shook his head. "None. That's how it works. He checks first. He never fires the ultimatum at anyone who can afford to hear it. 20 years, he told me, 20 years, and it never failed." He looked back at Calder, still seated, still gray, still certain in the way of a man who cannot afford to stop being certain. That's not a record of people agreeing with him. It's a record of people who couldn't afford to disagree. There's a difference, and it's the only difference that's ever mattered in a room like this one. The board member let go of his sleeve. "Thank you," she said, "for being the one who could afford it." "Don't thank me for that," Miles said gently. "Thank me for the license and the small mortgage. The rest of it was just arithmetic." And he left. Roman Calder was removed as CEO before the meeting formally adjourned. Not resigned removed the distinction preserved carefully in the minutes. The falsified certificate was referred to federal regulators, and directing the filing of a false federal safety certification is not a thing that stays a personnel matter. It became, in the language of the referral, a potential criminal one, and it attached to him personally by name, exactly the way a signature attaches to a certificate. In his one public statement, he said he had made a defensible business judgment under commercial pressure, which is what he told the board, and what he told the regulators, and what he presumably still believes, and which is the entire disease stated as a defense. He does not run anything now. Trent Mosby, the man who asked whether it would be reflected in his comp, and then signed, learned what Roman Calder learned one rung down and with less to cushion it. He was terminated for cause and named in the same referral because the hand that holds the pen is legally the hand that holds the pen. And he told me too, has never once been a certificate you can file. He did not get the promotion the loyalty was supposed to buy. Raina, the young test engineer who flagged the red and then let a senior guy talk her out of defending Miles in the break room, got the part of this she'd wanted and the part she hadn't known to want. Her red flag was cited in the record as correct and complete. She was promoted to lead the Ascend revalidation, and the seat that finally shipped in the spring with a retooled harness anchor passed dynamic 12 for 12 and has her sign-off in the file next to a compliance director's. She keeps the original failing report in her desk. She tells every new engineer the same thing: the test is allowed to fail. That's what the test is for. Say so out loud and don't stop saying it when the room wants you to. The rest resolved the way it resolves. The Ascend was recalled from every shelf before a single one had done in a real crash. What it did on the sled, no child was hurt. And that sentence is the entire point of the whole story. And it is true, because a 13-year-old moved a timeline. The 40 people on the floor who'd called Miles a coward found out all at once what the walkout had actually been, and there was no 15 men crying on the porch moment, because Miles didn't want one. But the senior guy who'd cut Raina off in the break room drove over one Saturday, stood on the step and said, "We said you ran," and Miles said, "I know it's what it looked like. I'd have thought so too," and that was the whole apology, and both men understood it was enough. And Gardwell, under a new CEO, and a board that had discovered the hard way what its compliance director's name was worth, offered Miles Rourke his job back. He turned it down. Then he took it on a condition and for a reason, and both are the end of the story. First, the reason he was the way he was, which he'd never told anyone, but which the board's outside attorney found in a 20-year-old case file while vetting him, and which explains everything. 22 years ago, Miles Rourke had been the junior engineer, not the man of record, the kid who ran the tests. And he had watched his boss, a decent man with 3 kids and a second mortgage, get told to sign off on a component that hadn't passed and watch that man's face while he did it, not because he was corrupt, but because he was leashed, because he was 3 paychecks from losing the house, and the person holding the pen knew it. Miles had said nothing because he was 22 and terrified and it wasn't his signature. And 8 months later that component failed in the field, and a child was hurt, not killed, but hurt badly enough that Miles Rourke had spent 22 years unable to forget a name he'd only read in a report. He'd gone home that night and decided 2 things: that he would never be the man with the leashed face. And this was the part it took him years to understand, that not being that man was not a matter of character. It was a matter of arrangement. You don't get to be unownable by wanting it badly in the moment. You build it slowly, boringly for decades out of a small house and a paid-off car and a license that's yours, and a refusal to need any single job so much that it can buy your name. He hadn't been saving money. He'd been saving the ability to say no. And he'd spent it all at once in a glass room on a Thursday, and he'd have told you it was the cheapest thing he ever bought. That was the held card. Here's the last one, the small one. On his way out of the building that first day, before Piper, before the hotline, before any of it, Miles Rourke had done one quiet thing that no one knew about. He'd taken the raw crash test video, the actual footage, and mailed a copy of it to himself and to his professional licensing board, sealed and dated, held in escrow, untouched. Not as a weapon, as a record. Because a man who has spent his life certifying the truth knows that the truth has to be somewhere that a shredder can't reach, and he had wanted it to exist even in the world where he lost, even in the world where the seat shipped and no one ever believed him. And the only thing left was that somewhere in a sealed envelope, the truth had a witness. He didn't need it in the end. Piper got there first. But when the board asked if there was any chance the raw footage had been altered or lost, Miles Rourke said no. There's a sealed, dated copy in escrow at my licensing board. Mailed the morning I walked out, and Adeyezequan looked at him for a long second and said, "You mailed yourself the evidence before you knew you'd ever need it." And Miles said, "I mailed it because I might never need it." That's when a record matters most, when nobody's coming to check. He took the job back on one condition, and it was in writing, and it was not for him. He asked for a rule, a real one, a mechanism, not a poster, that any employee at Gardwell at any level could refuse to sign, certify, or carry out an instruction they believed made a product unsafe and could not be fired demoted, docked, or quietly frozen out for that refusal. A door in the wall. He asked for it because he had spent 20 years buying his own private door, one skipped upgrade at a time, and he knew exactly how expensive that door was, and exactly how many good people Reynos Jr. engineers, the man with the leashed face, would never be able to afford one on their own. "You want to know how to make sure this doesn't happen again?" he told the new CEO. "It's not ethics training. It's not a hotline, although," he added, "the hotline worked out okay for us." He almost smiled. "It's this: make it so a person doesn't have to be able to walk away from their paycheck in order to keep their name. Right now, the only people in this building who can afford to say no are the ones who don't need the job. That's not a safety culture. That's just luck wearing a lanyard. They call it the Rourke Rule. It's on the wall." And Piper. Piper Rourke, 13, who had thought her father was a bit of a sucker who'd rolled her eyes at the return change and the dented car, and the whole careful, unflashy life of him, sat across from him at their small kitchen table one night. "After all of it, terrible movie." Paused popcorn between them and said in a smaller voice than usual, "All that stuff, the cheap car, not needing things. That was so you could do that, wasn't it? So you could walk out." Miles put down the bowl. "I didn't build us a cheap life, kid," he said. "I built us a free one. There's a difference, and most people never find out what it is because they never end up in the room." He tapped the table. "You found out at 13. You found out the night you hit submit. Everybody told me the brave thing that day was me walking out of that glass room. It wasn't. The brave thing was a kid who found a folder she wasn't supposed to find and decided she couldn't live in her own head if she put it back." Piper looked at the paused movie. "That's such a dad answer." "Yeah," Miles said. "It's the only one there is." She never called him a sucker again. And when her English class was assigned an essay that fall right about the bravest person you know, she didn't write about the CEO who got taken down or the video on the boardroom wall, or even quite about the man who drew a line through a certificate. She wrote about a guy who returned a bag of mulch. All right, let's be honest with each other. Miles Rourke isn't real. Neither is Roman Calder or the glass room or the seat called the Ascend. Gardwell isn't a company you can look up, but the glass room is real. You've been near it or you will be. Somewhere in almost every working person's life, there is a version of that room. A moment when someone with power over your paycheck asks you to sign the thing. Cut the corner. Look away. Ship it anyway. Be the hand and makes it very clear in a voice that might even sound kind what saying no is going to cost you. And here is the part nobody tells you, the part Roman Calder built a whole career on and was right about almost every time. Most people don't do the wrong thing because they're bad. They do it because they can't afford to be good. That's the real villain of this story. It was never quite Calder. It was the arrangement, the quiet, deliberate way the world is set up so that the people with principles are usually the people who can least afford to use them. And the person holding the leash always checks your finances before they pull it. So the thing this story is actually asking isn't would you have been brave in the glass room? It's this: the day someone tells you to obey or quit. The only thing that decides who you turn out to be is whether you can afford to walk. And that isn't decided in the room. It's decided years earlier in 1,000 boring choices nobody claps for. So are you building the kind of life that could say no, or are you buying the kind that can't? Tell me down in the comments. Be honest, I read them. And if you've ever been in that room, if someone ever checked what you couldn't afford to lose and then asked you to trade your name for it, type, "not with my name" below and go see how many people are standing in that glass room with you. It's going to be more than you think. It always is. If this one landed, hit like so it reaches the next person about to be handed a pen, and subscribe. There's a new one every week. Take care of each other out there. And don't buy nice things. Buy the ability to walk out of the room.